Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Voice of Adoptees. I'm your host, David. Today, I'm here with Petrea. She is a adoptee, a dog lover, and a self-care enthusiast. Welcome, Petrea, to the show. It's a pleasure to have you. If you could introduce yourself to our listeners, tell us where you're from, where you're adopted from, and a fun fact about you.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Petrea, and I use she, her pronouns. I am currently in Washington State, and I was adopted from Moscow, Russia. So, yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from and where I'm currently living. I grew up in the Bay Area, so that's where I was adopted to, and spent most of my life there.
Okay. So, when you refer to the Bay Area,
That's a good question.
that's California, right?
Yeah.
San
So
Fran?
yes, exactly. Yeah. So close to San Francisco. I was actually in the suburbs up north, so close by, but not quite in the city.
Oh, okay. Yeah, my mom's from Lodi.
Oh, nice.
Um,
Yeah. hmm
so I've been to California a lot. She was actually part of the San Francisco Yacht Club. Her family
Oh,
was growing up.
that's beautiful. It's beautiful over there. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Cool.
So, well, welcome. And you're adopted from Russia. That's cool. I'm adopted from Russia.
Oh, I didn't.
So I'm curious to know about everything that you have to share. So let's start at the very beginning. When did you come to the U.S. and all that? And
Yeah.
you can take it away.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So I was adopted in 1992 from Moscow, Russia, and I spent 2.5 years in an orphanage. Um, and then came straight over to California. I actually remember being adopted, and I remember the time before I was adopted, which is wild to think about. But I think it was just such a significant time in my life that it made a big impression. Um, but I remember being in this orphanage. It was, all female nurses. I hadn't seen a man until I took the flight literally from Moscow to California. And it was shocking to me. But yeah, I remember having the conversation with the nurses when I was in the orphanage, and they said, "Your mom is coming. She's coming to get you. You're being adopted. It's so wonderful." And of course, they were speaking in Russian, but the way that my mind works, I remember it in English. But yeah, I remember the orphanage. I remember playing with children. I read my documents very much later in life with help from actually a hospice nurse who is Russian, and she helped me to read what it said. And apparently, I was a biter in the orphanage. I don't
One of
remember that.
those kids. No, I'm just kidding.
Yes. You got to do what you got to do. So yeah, but I do remember that, and I remember when my mom came, she adopted me as a single woman, and she was an adoptee herself. But yeah, so she came and she adopted me, and I remember staying with her. The folks at the orphanage let me stay with her for a day before we left, I guess to familiarize each other, before we took this big trip to live together forever. And so I remember being in the apartment with her overlooking, there's a river in Moscow. And I remember I was so young, I was, almost 3, and I couldn't really understand the perspective. And so I remember looking down at the river and seeing the promenade, and there was a person who was walking with their dog. And I was terrified. I was so afraid of this dog, and I couldn't understand that it was far away from me. There was no way that it was going to touch me. And I remember also being, we were in a cab, and we obviously didn't speak the same language. She didn't speak Russian. She was Danish American. And so I remember being in this cab with her when we were headed somewhere, and she started tickling me because she thought it was cute and fun. But I hated it. And I remember, trying to tell her, "Stop, stop, stop," and she just did not understand, and eventually, the cab driver, who barely spoke any English, figured out a way to tell her, "You need to stop doing that. She's not liking it. You have to stop. You have to stop." Um, so it's kind of wild, but I definitely do remember that time. And then, I think my memories kind of fade from there, but that made a big impression on me.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
So you got okay, so then you came to California, and how long were you in California for?
I was there most of my life. So I lived in California from the time that I was adopted until I went to college. And I went to a college up in Washington. And that was an incredible experience. And it brought me up here actually later in life. And I work at the college that I that I attended, and it's wonderful, and I love it. The Northwest is so beautiful over here. But yeah, I was in California and in the Bay Area and in my house for most of the time. Um, and I was thinking about this, and I spoke with another adoptee about this. But my experience overall, I would say, was a net positive. I think that I was somebody who was very lucky in the way that my adoption turned out. And it's been interesting to understand how, even with mainly positive experience, I am still really traumatized. um, and yeah, but my life was pretty steady, especially with like my housing situation. I was in a wonderful area of the country, and I was there most of my life until I went off to college.
Wow. Well, I mean, it's weird because a lot of people I've noticed, especially adoptees, is as we get older, we start to realize that there's a lot more that happened when we were younger that kind of comes back to us in some ways. So
Yeah.
it's interesting that you're mentioning that, you still had trauma, even though you had such a positive experience, which,
Yeah.
yeah, and I can relate to you. I had a very positive experience as well. So it's hard to listen to some of these stories that are very different than ours. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
definitely. But so what was it like? You mentioned that your adoptive mother was an adoptee as well. What was it
Mm,
like having your own mom who adopted you also be an adoptee? Did that help in some ways if you had questions about like what adoption was growing up, or how talk to us about that?
yeah. I think overall it helped. One of the ways that it showed up in my life is that it was never a secret that I was adopted. That was something that from the day that I came to the US, we talked about. I don't think it would have been easy for my mom to hide that fact, but at the same time, it was never a secret, and it was ubiquitous in my house because she was also adopted. And I think it potentially has tones that are, in line with toxic positivity, but she would say things like, "Well, I didn't have you, I chose you." And in some ways, I think that can be kind of icky, but it can also be, I think for me at the time, the way that I took it, it was actually a positive. It made me feel like we were on purpose, and she always talked about it in a positive light. And but again, like I'm saying, I think that it was some toxic positivity because we never talked about the negative aspects of adoption. That was never on the table. And so I think as a result, I was almost like unaware of my adopted identity or the potential pitfalls of being an adopted person. And I did not look into, you know, the consequences of my adoption, like, I don't know, the attachment style that I have, for example, or anything like that until I was into my 30s. And before then, I genuinely did not relate to the adoptees that were around me for, in large part
Yeah.
because many of them were struggling with significant questions about their identity or um, any number of things that you hear adoptees speaking about, and I could not relate. It was almost like it was so normal to me that I didn't think it was anything.
Yeah. No, I totally understand what you're saying. Do you remember what age you started asking questions about your adoption?
I think that I was asking questions throughout my life, but they were more questions, I think, about, like, my birth mother, for example, and that was pretty much it. It was very limited, from what I remember, and the big questions didn't come until I was into my 30s. I'm 34 now, so that just gives you an idea. But yeah, I remember having questions about my birth mother and my adoptive mother, who I always just called my mom, and I call my birth mom my birth mom. I know people have different terminology, but that's just what I grew up knowing.
Yep.
I just asked about, how old was she? What was, is there anything that you know about her? And the conversation about my birth mother was mainly telling me, okay, well, she was relatively young. She was in her 20s. And something that you should know is that your birth mother was an alcoholic. And so you might struggle with that in your life. You should be aware that you might have addiction problems. And so it was, simultaneously, it was a conversation of how my birth mother did something that was courageous and, to put me up for adoption was guaranteeing that I had a better life and all of those kinds of things, which are tropes. And I don't necessarily think that that's true in adoption, but it's what was said to me. Um, and so that was kind of the conversation that we had about my birth mother.
Did you ever conduct a birth search or anything like that?
I didn't until later. I talked about wanting to find my birth mother when I was in my teen years, and my mom hated that idea. uh, but I never had the resources or really support from her in any other way than just saying, "Well, if that's what you want to do, then go ahead." So I didn't pursue anything until again I was in my 30s. And my mom passed away when I was 26, so she hasn't been around, you know, in this time that I've even been thinking or talking about these things. Um, but yeah, when I was in my 30s, I started searching around. I was looking at the documentation that I had. I started learning how to read Russian so I could figure some of these things out. And I started just searching different avenues, different social media, just on Google, whatever. I think it's a little bit challenging because there are some, blockades between the countries regarding communication, and there's not really open access, for U.S. citizens to Russian information. So I think it's a little bit challenging. But besides doing some Google searches and social media checks, I haven't really done very much.
Um, I know the very popular social networking sites are VK and then
Yeah,
OK.ru. Those are the ones that everyone use.
yeah,
Um, I do know in my Russian, and I'm not sure if you're in my Russian adoptees Facebook group or not, but
yeah.
oh,
I-
okay, okay, yeah. Um, uh, there's a woman on there who does searches. She's a detective, and it couldn't be more Russian than this. But she
yeah,
literally pays off some guy who works at like the passport office, and they search like your
yeah,
history and pull up all these records, and that's how she gets her information within like 24 hours. She literally just goes to this contact she has in the passport office, and they pull up the official records that the government has on
that's
the
incredible.
biological parents. So
Wow, well,
if
that's a great tip.
if you're interested, just make a post in the group. Sometimes say, hey, I'm looking for I'm trying to remember her first name, but you can call like the investigator, and everyone will know who you're talking about, and then connect with
Oh,
her. And so it's a quick way to kind of figure things out. So
oh,
yeah,
that's incredible. I will definitely do that. Thank you for the tip. I appreciate it.
yeah, absolutely. So have you ever Have you ever traveled back to Russia or ever wanted to travel back?
I have not traveled back yet, and it is something that I've wanted to do. It's actually something I wanted to do with my mom. She was a travel agent in her life, and then before she was a travel agent, she was a social hostess on a cruise ship. So she traveled around the world, which is why she even knew to go to Moscow to adopt a child. Um, but yeah, we had plans before right before she died to take a cruise around Russia and the different there's like river cruises that you can take.
Yeah,
Um, and then soon after she passed away and it hasn't been a good time. I think also, the political kind of landscape in Russia right now is challenging. And so it doesn't feel like it would be a good time to go. But eventually I would love to go. I've been very curious to see, where I come from as an
yeah,
adult. Yeah.
absolutely. Um, are you aware that you're still a Russian citizen? So you would have to travel back into the country on a Russian passport. So you have to
Ah,
do this application work, and it's kind of a pain. But
wow. I
um,
didn't know that.
yeah, so it's Russian law that if you're born on Russian soil, you're basically in their eyes a citizen for life. So
Incredible.
there are some people that have traveled back to Russia on like a US visa,
Hmm.
and that's technically illegal, and it's just an oversight. They're not supposed to be granting that because you are from Russia. So
Wow.
that's just something to know. So
Wow.
again, there's people in our group,
Yeah.
and me included, who help with that type of process. So again, whenever you're ready or need help, we have a lot of resources. So yeah,
That's so cool. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's such an interesting technicality. Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, it's very strange. I think that I've had also like a different legal process than many adoptees regarding at least international adoptees regarding like my citizenship and those kinds of things. I'm a US citizen now. I wasn't when I first came in. And the way that I got citizenship was through an exception that the Clinton administration posted. Sorry, can you hear my dog?
it's okay. That's gonna be
Okay.
taken care of.
Anyway, the way that I got citizenship was through an exception that was posted by the Clinton administration. There was like a fast track basically for citizenship for people who were adopted from certain regions of Eastern Europe from certain dates. And so I happened to fall within that criteria, and my passport was fast tracked. So I'm sure I could get one, but I don't have a birth certificate like a naturalized U.S. citizen would. I think I have my Russian one, and then I have my Russian passport.
Yeah,
Um,
so if you're doing yeah, when it comes to renewing your Russian passport and getting a new one and all that, they don't need any American documents. They just need your Russian paperwork. They
oh,
don't care
cool.
about the American. Like I didn't know that when I brought mine to the consulate. They literally separated the two, and like American, all the English copies and Russian. They took it and just dumped it in the trash.
They're like, no,
They're
yeah,
like, nah, yeah.
uh,
But it's funny you mentioned that you came here, you weren't a citizen for a while. I was the same
yeah.
situation. I didn't come here until '96 though,
Oh,
uh,
okay.
but I still had a USSR passport, even
Cool.
though it ended like
Me too.
5 years ago. They just
Yeah,
still were handing them out because that's Russia
yep,
for you.
yep, same,
And when I came here, I was on like an alien card and like a
yep,
visa for a
same.
while, and
Yeah.
my parents actually I got the citizenship granted. They called it like they acquired it. Like
Hmm. Hmm.
I didn't have a naturalization process. I don't have a
Yep,
naturalization certificate.
yep.
I just have a certificate of citizenship. And
Yep.
what my parents did is just to kind of like readopt me. They went to the New Hampshire courts and got it, and so I have a New Hampshire birth
Mm.
certificate now that recognizes my birth in Russia, but it says I'm a like U.S. in
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of odd because
Yeah.
we were adopted before the year 2000, which that's when like the international adoption law kicked in, where you automatically get it right away.
Right.
So I don't know if you had any issues when you were applying to like colleges and FAFSA, but I had to send my copies of proving I'm a citizen everywhere I went. Like it was
Mhm.
so annoying, and yeah, but that's a struggle that I guess only international adoptees understand.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
interesting. I don't remember those challenges, but it very well may
oh,
have
you're
been.
lucky then.
Yeah, it could have been that I was just a lucky one. I also went to a school that was kind of loosey-goosey, so who knows, maybe they were just like, "This is good enough."
Oh well, do you have a driver's license? Sounds good.
Yeah, sweet, let's do this, yeah.
So what's your opinion on Russian food? Have you ever tried it, experimented, or cooked it? And did
Yeah,
that bring back any memories, if you have any from the orphanage or anything?
so let's see. My opinions on Russian food. Well, I haven't had that much, so I'll say that first and foremost. I don't think I have a well-rounded opinion of Russian food. I love borscht. I love beets, I love pickled things. And I think that I want to believe that those are Russian qualities. But I think that regarding Russian food, it's like, I think it's more like I want to like it because it's Russian. And I want to be connected to my culture, and I want to think that it's because of my identity in that way. But there's some Russian food that I've had that I'm just like, no, I don't like it. Some stuff, like I've had some sweets, I think, that are just way too sweet for me, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, there are certain things that I really like, and I think it's like this kind of magical thing in my mind, like, oh, it's so Russian, and this is just me being Russian.
Did you have any information on your medical history when you were adopted?
There was a little bit in my documentation that they sent over. They kept records of when I was a brand new baby, so um, I was premature 2 months, and then there were some details about my progression just kind of month by month. I think that the country was involved, the government was involved in kind of monitoring my well-being when I got relinquished. So they took some notes, and those are included, but it's not very clear to me exactly what's going on with those notes because I don't read Russian fluently. But yeah, there are some details regarding like my health and those kinds of things.
Mhm.
That are in those Russian documents. Sorry.
Have you trying to think? Were there any gaps missing on your Russian paperwork that you later discovered? Um, like for some people I've known who are adopted from Russia had their birthday that was actually wrong, or they just left out, the biological father's name. Were there
Mhm.
any gaps on any of your paperwork?
Not that I know of. However, when I was, in conversations with my mom about my birth mother and I guess my adoption, she said that she believed that my birth father's name was fabricated. So that could be a potential gap. And kind of in the other direction of finding out more information, when I was an adult and I read through the documentation that I had with that nurse, I found out that I have a half sister who's 6 years older than I am, and I did not know that for the majority of my life.
Wow. Was she also adopted, or is she in Russia still?
She's in Russia still, so yeah, my birth mother kept her.
How does that? What's the age difference between the two of you?
So she's let's see, so she was 6 when I was born, so it's 6 years. Yeah.
And how does that make you feel?
I don't know if I mean, I think it creates curiosity in me. I think I am just like, more than being curious about my birth mother, I'm very curious about my sister. Um because we would be closer in age, and I don't know, I think for that reason, since I found out that she was there, I was just like, who is she? But yeah, I don't know. Other than that, there's no big emotions around it. It's just more like a curiosity regarding who she is.
Yeah. Well, I was just curious because I have younger siblings in Russia as well, and um, my birth mother, when she relinquished me, said, it was for financial reasons and all this. But then a year later, she had my sister and then
See.
kept her. And I've always kind of in the back of my head thought like, hmm,
Mm,
did your
mhm.
financial situation change that drastically in 1 year?
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
it's always been in the back of my head. I don't have any resentment or anything, like,
sure.
but I'm just, like you said, we're just
Uh,
curious.
yeah, absolutely, yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Wow, that is interesting. So, if you were to think about like being adopted and everything, when you were at early age, like going through elementary school, middle school, maybe even to high school, did you ever run into any, I guess, challenges that maybe stemmed from being adopted that you didn't realize at the time? Or I
Yeah,
know you said yeah. Oh,
yeah, definitely. So it's been strange to figure this out or piece it together as an adult, but I think it's hard to say completely, but yeah. So, as I mentioned, my mom was a travel agent and, she had this history of being a social hostess on a cruise ship. And so she had all of these people that she knew around the world. And from time to time, she would travel for her work to meet with people and kind of reconnect and do those things that she had to do. And when she would do that, I would go spend time in New Mexico with my godmother, who was, a childhood friend of hers. And I loved my godmother. It was wonderful. I loved staying with her. Um, but when my mom would come back to pick me up after, 2 or 3 weeks, however long she would be away, it was an issue. It was always an issue. And I hated it. I hated it. I hated going back to her. I had like a big reaction every single time. It was so hard for both of us. I mean, it was like I felt like she was a stranger and I just did not want to go with her. And being an adult and looking back on that, it makes a lot more sense now because she left, and I'm sure that I didn't like that being somebody who was, dealing with probably deep abandonment issues. I mean, I believe that I do, and I have.
yeah.
Um, and so, when I was a child and when I was with her, we never reflected on it in that way. It was never understood from that viewpoint. It was like just hard to understand. It was kind of this mystery. Why would Petrea be behaving that way? Why is she out of control? She would ask, "Why don't you want to come back?" And um so I definitely remember that. That was one thing that came up. That was a big one. I also remember this feeling, and I don't know. I've asked other adoptees if they have this feeling as well, or if they've experienced this, and I believe some have. But something that I noticed, I loved my mom a lot, but something a- about it was is I did not want to be physically close to her. It bothered me to be physically close to her. I didn't want to cuddle up with her. I didn't really want to hug her. It felt kind of disturbing to me to be right next to her. And it was like she felt off. She smelled different than she should. It's not like she smelled bad or anything like that. She was perfectly fine. There was
Yeah. Yeah.
nothing wrong with her in that way. But there was this internal sensation for me that like, no, I don't want to be close like that. And that's another thing that was always so strange to me when I was growing up. It didn't really like why I couldn't understand why I would feel that way. But now I think that it might be tied to my early life, and my adoption and relinquishment and all of those things.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's definitely interesting. Yeah, that's hard to, especially when you don't know the reason, like why it just feels not right. But
Yeah.
as you get older, you might eventually just kind of figure it out on your own.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, so being adopted, there's a lot of there's people that are opinionated when it comes to having their own biological kids one day
Mm,
because they feel the need to see themselves in like a
mm,
child because they want that biological attachment.
yeah.
Um, what's your opinion on that? And do you think you're going to have kids one day?
It's a good question. I think I would like to have children one day. I think that I am drawn to that idea too. I think that it's kind of an interesting thing as an adopted person. And being an adopted person who's never met any biological family, I've never done that before. I don't know, I don't have that connection. And so I think that there is something charming or magical or I don't know, appealing
Yeah,
about the idea of having somebody on this planet that I'm connected to who is related to me biologically. So I definitely understand that perspective and desire. There are things that make me wonder about having children in this world, but as far as that perspective,
true.
yeah,
That's
I
an
definitely,
understatement.
yeah, yeah. But if world events and all of those things were not an issue, yeah, of course, I would immediately say yes. And it's been interesting too because as an adult, and as I've reflected more on adoption and what it means to be adopted, and the various things that maybe have been affected in my life because of my relinquishment and adoption, I view adoption in a different way now. And for much of my life, I was very positive about adoption, and I couldn't really empathize with people, when they told me that they had a hard adoption or, didn't support it. It was like, what are you talking about? You are lucky. And as I've gotten older and become a little bit more educated and also heard more perspectives from other adopted people, I am less supportive of adoption, just generally speaking. I'm very critical of the money that's, at least in the United States, I'll say it that way. In the United States, it's a for profit industry, and there's lots of problematic aspects about it historically and also currently. So, although I'm not completely anti adoption, I am much more critical of adoption than I ever was growing up. And I think I've gained some empathy regarding adoptions that didn't look like mine.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point you made. Um, what did your friends and other family members think about you being adopted? I know you mentioned, you always knew you were adopted growing up and you didn't see it as really a big deal until you got older, but what did your friends and, other relatives think about it?
Yeah. Well, my mom was all for it. she was
I hope
she
so.
she was adopted too, and so I think that she liked that we were both adopted. It was something that we had in common. So from her perspective, it was great. And then, my really it was my mother and then my grandmother was around for a little while until she passed away when I was 11. And she loved me very much, and I don't think that we ever really talked about my adoption. It was never an issue. Um, I wasn't really in touch with other families, so that was kind of it for the family that that would have an opinion. And then like close friends around me, when friends my age, it was always curiosity regarding like, um, well, where's your real mom? That would be a phrase that was said.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. It's interesting because I think back on that and I remember hearing that phrasing always irritated me because, at that time, my adoptive mother was my real mom to me.
Yeah.
And, um, and so it was confusing to me. That's kind of how it was framed for me. And so I was always just like, I don't even know why you're talking about this lady. But it was always met with curiosity. And I think that I was pretty quick to just say, well, it's not a thing for me. So I don't really know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think in that way, when I was young, um, it was kind of a shut down conversation. I do remember when I was in elementary school, I was pulled out of class to attend a support group that I didn't sign up for, but I was included in because I was adopted,
Yep.
and it
Me too.
was
Yep.
interesting. Yeah. So I was pulled in, and it was the counselor, and she was with a group of adoptees. It was like all of us all together, and looking back, I'm like, what the hell? But anyway, this was the 90s, and
Yeah.
yeah, and so we sat together, and then it was like these adults in the room being like, well, what are your feelings? What's up? And I do remember children children around me were voicing their anger, and there was a lot of like, why wasn't I wanted? And those kinds of thoughts and feelings were coming up for people, for my peers, and um I could not relate. I just could not relate at the time.
You're the
So
one sitting there saying, I don't know, when's lunch?
right, exactly. I was like, thanks for the pizza. Can I go now? Like I just it was I was so disconnected from it as a kid, that I couldn't get it.
Yeah.
I like, bummer, like, I'm sorry that you don't see that you were lucky, that kind of thing. And
Yeah.
I'm grateful that I that I have a more developed perspective now, and I would never say something like that anymore. But that's truly how I felt, and I think it was because of my upbringing.
Yeah. That's awesome. I'm right there with you. I'd be the same person probably asking when's lunch. So,
Right.
um,
Yeah.
so my final question to you is, if there's a piece of advice or wisdom that you want to leave for our listeners, what would it be?
Well, let's see. Um, for anyone who's considering adopting, please look into the trauma that's associated with it, because it is a traumatic event. And there's research to support that being relinquished is traumatic for a child, no matter their age. So be trauma informed, please. And then, to anybody who is an adoptee, if you find yourself struggling in any way, therapy is a great resource, and I definitely suggest looking into it. And I would also say that it's possible to find providers who are also adopted themselves. And that's actually what I did when I was kind of investigating my adoptee identity. I sought out a therapist who was adopted too. And it created a connection that I haven't had with other people that I've been in therapy with. So that would be my suggestion.
Love it. I love it. That's great. Uh, Petrea, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me. It's been great. We loved your story, and you are welcome to come back anytime. And if you have any updates, we'd love to hear about it.
Cool. Thank you. I really appreciate being here.
Of course. And thank you to all of our listeners as well. For those who want to hear Petrea's story, please visit your podcast platform or our website, voiceofadoptees.com. If you or someone you know is adopted, schedule an interview to be featured on our show. Don't forget to like, subscribe, rate, and share this episode to spread the voice of adoptees. And make sure to check out our new Patreon page. On behalf of all of us, we thank you for listening, and we will see you next week. Voice of Adoptees. Who am I?